That's right, today we'll be reviewing Gear Strive the board game. It's a 2-player game that is using level 99's Exceed system, and now for 20 Guilty Gear characters. It's real expensive though, at a whopping $164 off the website after shipping. That is the most I've ever spent on any board game without tons of minis. Another problem is, I'm a board game and TCG veteran. I don't really know much about fighting games, so I've enlisted some help.
Oh, you good? Hey! I've been enlisted because I play a lot of fighting games, especially Guilty Gear. I messed around with some of the older Guilty Gear games, like Plus R and Exerd, and I've also done like the wiki lore deep dives. But Strive is really where I've put in a lot of my time. I think I'm at around 800 hours of playtime as of this recording, and yeah, I've started going to tournaments this year. I'm by no means a good player. I drowned in pools at EVO, but I at least have a basic understanding of how every character works, or like what they want to do. And we put that into testing all of these characters on screen before making this review.
By the way, this video is brought to you by you guys. You guys are sponsoring this video basically. Thank you to all of you that have supported us on Patreon and our coffee to help make reviews like this. Back to the review now. How to play. The goal is to just kill the other fighter to reduce them to 0 health, usually by landing attacks on them. We'll be passing off turns of doing one action. On your turn, you can do one of several actions. You got standard card management actions like drawing, discarding to draw more, reshuffling your discard into your deck, etc. Then there's a slightly more in-depth actions you can take. You can pay cards to move 1 card per space. It costs 1 extra to jump over the opponent. Then you got boosts, which are like abilities at the bottom of your card. These buff you until the end of your next fight. Some of these boosts have this little symbol.
Oh hey, that's the Roman cancel symbol. So you get to do your boost and then keep playing?
Yep, you got it. So you can pay 1 card to cancel after you play that boost. In doing this, the boost stays in effect and you get to take another action right away. If you got a lot of cancelable boosts, you can chain them all together. Since this is a fighting game, you want to hit your opponent. This is called a strike. You play a card from your hand face down to use this top card as an attack. This is an action. Then your opponent immediately plays a card from their hand face down as well. The faster player resolves their entire attack, then the slower player does theirs. If you do enough damage, you might be able to stun your opponent, which effectively stops their attack. Strike fast and strike hard. Of course, if their strike has enough guard, they won't get stunned. You really want to hit attacks because successful attacks go to your gauge area instead of being discarded. Gauge is used for these ultra attacks and for the exceed action. To exceed, it's an action and permanently buffs your character's passive ability. Everyone is different, but it's generally always better to have your exceed ability over your regular ability. That's pretty much it. You just keep trading off turns until one person decks out twice or gets to 0 HP. Component pros. For component pros, we want to start out by saying this mat is really nice, has the space for everything you need, and also the game comes with these 2 metal tokens to keep track of health. They say heaven or hell on them, so you can figure out where your body is going after death as you move these things closer and closer to 0. Also super neat that they give you a deck box for every single character. I mean, most games don't even come close to providing this, and Guilty Gears has art and difficulty rating on them. Really helps you set up a match, which is already lightning fast. It's pretty much just taking your deck and character out. Player aids are nice, albeit small. Super convenient that you can just hand over your fighter's reference to your opponent so they can know your specials and ultras. The color coding on cards is really good. When you see them in your hand, all of them are quite distinguished, from normals to specials with your faces, and ultis really jump out with you with the red theme. Fighting icons are clear, like speed, range, and power, super distinct. Gameplay pros. Strive and other fighting games are very character focused, so we'll try to highlight some of the characters and their matchups. But first, let's talk about the overall game and the system mechanics. So Adam, take the mic.
The game really implements the spacing aspect of fighting games well. Attacks all have different ranges, and certain attacks and boosts and abilities will cause a character to advance or retreat or push or pull their opponent. This means you're constantly considering how to move and space around your opponent. Since the game doesn't distinguish between ground and air movement, there's no real height aspect. You won't see movement options like air dashing or even jumping. However, I feel the movement and spacing game is so satisfying that I didn't really notice that there wasn't this ground versus air distinction. Well done.
Cards being dual use is also well implemented, with the boost on the bottom allowing for any attack to double as a spell. Kind of anything is possible by throwing away what would be an attack, so you gotta see if that loss is okay. A great slightly out of the box bottom is block. This lets you guess a card in your opponent's hand, and they must discard it if you guess correctly. This is fantastic for getting rid of an opponent's crazy fast or slow attack you think they've been saving, especially for ultimates once you see their gauge getting real stacked. This gets compounded by the cancel mechanic, which again is where you discard after playing certain boosts to maintain your turn instead of passing it off. It makes turns feel much more dynamic and open with being able to add on to an attack you play right away. In practice, you're throwing away 2 cards to usually upgrade an attack, which adds more weight onto that attack, so you better land it that round. It also just adds more spice into the mix of what happens before, during, and after attacks. Like, see this card that makes your attack stronger, this one that increases your speed. Okay, you got the point, because we talked about boosts already, right? I mean, with all the characters here, the possibilities are pretty endless. If you're really gung-ho and have cards in hand, you can do the 2 boosts for 1 attack by double canceling. It's like a fighting game combo.
Definitely agree. The boost canceling system is super interesting. If I had to compare it to something in Strive, I would say it's more similar to starting a combo with a mix-up off of Blue Roman cancel. For example, I don't get much off of this hit if I just do it normally. But if I do the Blue Roman cancel, I slow my opponent down and get a combo. So I'm sort of buffing myself or debuffing the opponent to allow myself to get a more rewarding hit.
Something else that also feels like combo is the advantage keyword. This triggers after landing certain attacks, and it means that if you just went, you get advantage, meaning you get to go again. And it's real good to go again because you can pretty much do anything, like drawing cards, but also you break ties in card speeds. This allows you to prepare for turns where you want to land 2 or maybe 3 attacks in a row, and maybe force your opponent to wild swing and attacking off the top of their deck if their hand is empty. It's really up to you. You could do any action, so even just getting advantage to draw or reposition puts you ahead. For the defender side, this means that they might want to play attacks that get them advantage to grab advantage. And the way advantage is given out is that it goes to the player who did their attack last. So maybe players will try to slow down their speed to maintain advantage. These 8 normal attacking cards for every player are also really well integrated. They exist in this really nice parity with one another with their own top use that splash with every single character we've tried seamlessly. There's cards that dash onto you, there's super fast ones to grab your opponent and pull them, and then there's even stuff to ignore armor. Here's a more in-depth look at how they use when played against each other. You can grasp someone to stun them before they make their dive, which would normally escape their attacks after the dive. But grasping isn't always good because grasping a focus doesn't stun them. It also does 1 measly damage, and if someone is focused, they can't be pushed or pulled from a grasp. Or the slowest sweep does 6 damage and forces the opponent to discard a card. But again, this can lose to dive, which can negate all damage. Lastly, block is excellent for a guaranteed way to build your gauge and take less damage, but it does no damage in of itself, and must discard cards to negate damage over 2. Oh yeah, we talked about these all going into the characters, so now, Adam, let's get into those now.
Finally, I'll say that characters feel very true to the game. If you're familiar with Guilty Gear, you should be able to pick up a box and feel right at home with their unique cards and Exceed ability.
Yeah, Exceed is a really cool progression system. It feels good to use Exceed well, like upgrading Kai to draw every time you cancel, holy cow, but it's not always going to be the right decision. Since Exceed costs gauge, you might get punished if you use it and drain all your gauge. Remember, you can use a gauge for ultra attacks, buffing your blocks, and for a lot of actions where you need to discard, but don't want to discard your stuff in your hand. So you really need to think about when and how you'll Exceed. As a whole, this Exceed system really makes the card play feel alive. You always have something to do on your turn, whether it's discarding cards to move, or you can use them as spells to boost your character, or you can use them for, of course, their primary usage as a hidden bluff and attack. If you land it, you can get even more benefits. You can even pay cards from your gauge to draw even more cards if you don't have a meaningful way to spend them. Or if you don't want to play a card on a turn, you can always just draw 2. Or you can reshuffle your discard into your deck. It's really with the dual usage cards and varied action space on your turn that you really don't feel victim to railroaded feeling turns. Character-specific pros.
I'll say right off the bat, the characters we played all feel very unique, and most of them are pretty faithful to the original game. We still haven't played every matchup. I mean, there's 20 characters in this box, so I made sure to try out some of the more famous ones to make sure they felt just right. We started with Sol and Kai, who are expectedly quite vanilla. I think they're a great way to learn the game and the system without getting overwhelmed by having to consider the more unique character abilities in the game. Then we tried out the classic Zoner versus Grappler matchup with Axel and Potemkin. Axel won this one, as expected. Axel's ability boosts the range on his normals, so he has a lot of ways to keep Pot out. He also has a bunch of specials which let him get away from the opponent, either by pushing them or by him running away. This really plays into his keep away zoner style, and it constantly forces Potemkin to burn cards just to move. That said, when Potemkin does get in, it hurts like hell. His ability buffs attacks within range 1, and Potemkin Buster already hits like a truck, so that's even more damage. It's just so hard for him to get in against Axel's onslaught of zoning. We then decided to make Axel suffer, and played Axel versus Chip. Chip's ability lets him constantly advance and retreat, which is a great way to translate his insane mobility into this board game. On top of that, he is constantly drawing cards. This means he is not only weaving in and out of Axel's ranges, but also winning the resource war. Axel's specials can backfire in this matchup, as there are some dead zones at close range that Chip can easily run into. It quickly became clear that Chip could force Axel to whiff and then punish him. Another really nice touch was Chip's boosts, which buffed both him and his opponent, really putting his glass cannon status on full display. I also really wanted to try a mix-up character. Since there's no distinction between high and low block, I wanted to see how they implemented this type of character in the game. I tried out Ino, who is now purely rushdown. Her ability lets you advance 2 spaces and then attack for the cost of 1 card instead of the usual 3. On top of that, some of Ino's moves synergize with this ability, letting her advance even further, and sometimes even getting buffed if she does advance before attacking. This is sort of like doing hover dash into an attack, which is quintessential Ino. I was curious to see how board game Ino differed from a more grounded rushdown character like Giovanna. Gio certainly had some similarities with good movement and quick strikes, but her character and exceed ability is more based around the buffs she gets in the game with meter. It's nice that they focused on a different mechanic of the character to make sure she felt distinct. Oh, and if you know about Faust, who has a bunch of random items in the game, he gets those now in the form of boosts, which he draws off the top of his deck. Leo, who is memed on as the monkey mode character for just hitting buttons like wildly swinging, gets rewarded for wild swinging, which is randomly playing the top card of your deck as an attack. This demonstrates level 99's ability to capture character asymmetry and identity within the constraints of their exceed system. It is also amazing replay value. As there are 20 characters in the game, that means there's 380 unique matchups available for you to try out.
Yeah, the sheer replayability is ridiculous, and when we zoom in, each character has 7 unique cards, combined with the standard 8 normal cards to leave lots of possibilities for each strike interaction. Now note that there's usually only 2 of each card, of course there are exceptions, but still it's really easy to keep track of what your opponent has played as you see their discard. So then you can think about how their gauge is like and how they're piloting their character, so you can really guess what they want to do. The classic is when someone has just built up their gauge and are clearly in range to do their super attack. So are they going to use their super now or simply use another attack to continue building that gauge? Or maybe they're doing their super and you can do your super that is faster and stuns them to make their attack fall off. It's super rewarding to either dodge or outspeed another player's super because that means they're spending their bar to maybe do nothing. And remember, when it's your turn, you can always cancel your boost to modify your attacks, which can spook your opponent. Oh wait, what do you mean? He's EX to +1 every stat? Oh snap, well, what could he be playing? One highlight of being a mind game baller is playing a super that has a limited close range, so your opponent doesn't expect that to be played yet. But then you boost it to go slower. Then he's advancing like you thought he was gonna do, bam, he's in range and you do a giant slam to be on your way to win the game. Component cons. Starting with component cons, if you're not familiar with Guilty Gear like me, when you're starting this, you'll probably be lost or have to do a lot of reading when trying to learn these characters. There is nothing describing them in the game. Adam would usually give me a quick rundown of how a character worked in Strive, and that helps me connect the character ability to a general game plan. Having a quick strategy summary for new players would be super helpful. This is especially felt for 1-star or the hardest characters. When you're learning the game, definitely start with Soul and Kai. Otherwise, some of these other characters will definitely confuse you. Also, new players would be helped by a bigger player aid, which is currently tiny with tons of dead space. And your fighter's player aid doesn't explain their exceed and or character, which is kind of the most important thing about them. You don't want to be constantly flipping that card in the middle of the board. As for other component cons, it's not much. Like visually, the 0 looks too much like an 8. Or how the art is sometimes just not clear on cards because they literally just screenshotted the game. You're screenshotting 60 FPS with no motion blur, so as a picture, it just looks wacky. Especially since the background isn't clean, it's just the home stage. So sometimes you get this really cool visual of doing these ultis, other times it's just kind of a vague jumping around thing where the figure blends into the background. This is a card game with a lot of other visual things going on the card, so the art needs to be clear on what it is when you flip it over when you attack. Last component con is that the box is way too freaking big. Like to the extent it's very impractical with lots of wasted space inside. It doesn't fit in a lot of bookshelves, is cumbersome to move around. Like why? Oh, it's because they ship you the same box they use for the collector's edition on Kickstarter, which has standees. Ha 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 ha, so now you have 6 slots to put metal coins in when you only get 2, whoopee. It's just currently massive. It's closer to my TI4 box, whereas it's way bigger than a full-size card game box like Ashes Reborn. Gameplay cons. Just as we did before, we're going to start with the general gameplay cons, then go into the character-specific gameplay cons. The first general gameplay con is with labeling. Board Game Strive is by no means a light game. Like, sure, it can be short. It can be if someone gets early victory. But yeah, even then, there's no kidding that there's a ton of moves to learn just from the basic attacks alone. There's a lot of reading of 2 halves of a card, and definitely not even close to 15 minutes on average when starting. Heck, in our final games, Adam and I had matches that went 45 minutes. Admittedly, we were playing a stall-like matchup, but it can happen. In the board game zeitgeist, a light game is like Coup, which is rated at 15 minutes. Look at Coup's cards, then look at Guilty Gear's cards. And there's more Guilty Gear cards. At lightest, Guilty Gear Strive is medium light, but we felt comfortable calling it medium weight.
The last general con we have is with how you fill the gauge. You know, the thing that most of the progression in the game is based around. Filling this gauge is tied almost exclusively to landing hits. In some matches, this can feel miserable because you'll spend multiple cards just to get into range and do your attack. And if you miss your attack, it feels like you spent all those cards for nothing. I think some things that you could do to remedy this is to give you gauge for simply moving forward. Maybe 1 gauge for every 3 to 4 spaces you advance. This would also incentivize using the move action, because currently I think that's a bit weak. Usually it's more efficient to just look for moves and abilities that let you advance instead of actually taking move as an action. This would not only be helpful, but also thematic, as Guilty Gear gives you tension gauge for aggressive options like moving forward. You could also gain a small amount of gauge for getting hit. Maybe you get 1 card in your gauge for every 10 damage. This would give you a little bit of a comeback mechanic, but nothing too crazy.
Character-specific cons.
As we mentioned earlier, a lot of the characters feel very faithful to the original source material and are unique to play. However, there were a couple characters who we played who just felt a bit off. As a Baiken main in Strive, I was excited to see how she played in the game. Her character ability seems to be a nod to her tether mechanic in Strive, allowing her to pull the opponent in and attack them at the cost of 1 gauge. However, I didn't find myself using this as much as I thought I would. Baiken's specials also have this weird mechanic where they get buffed if you have 3 or fewer cards in hand. It's possible that something's just not clicking in my mind, but it feels like the devs tried a bit too hard to make Baiken feel different without really considering how she played in this board game. Even Ashton said she seemed weaker than the rest of the cast. At the very least, she shouldn't be listed as a 3-star difficulty, which is the easiest to use. Nagoriyuki was another character who I think could use some tweaking. I think as the Nago player, he seems very fun and faithful to the original. He has high damaging specials, which let him draw 4 and discard 2, which is a clear translation of the blood gauge mechanic. And when he decks out, he goes into Blood Rage, where he is locked out of specials and loses health every turn. I think for the most part, if you are playing as Nago, it feels very similar to playing as him in Strive. The problem with this iteration of Nago is that playing against him is boring. Since Blood Rage is inevitable, you just have to run away and wait him out. In the video game, you do have to camp Nago sometimes, but there is another phase of gameplay where you do have to move in and pressure or hit him while he's at high blood. And while it's stressful to play, it is at least more interesting to me than just camping him out for the entire game. The other big character con was with Zato, who really just can't seem to catch a break these days. In the video game, Zato controls both himself and his shadow puppet, Eddie. It's very scary when both of them are on screen, since they can attack at the same time and really just smother you. In this game, Zato can still summon Eddie, but it feels much harder to pressure with him. When Eddie is on the board and you're using a special, you calculate range from him instead of from Zato. This makes for some interesting positioning choices. Also, if you get a hit, you gain advantage. Aside from a few niche cases, Eddie will go away on cleanup after he uses a special. This makes sense thematically and from an initial balance perspective, as letting Eddie run wild would be way too strong. However, the issue with playing as Zato is that Eddie does not feel like he is worth using. To summon him, you have to commit to using a specific normal or boost. And until you exceed, Eddie will probably not spawn where you want him to. Zato's most powerful cards have very specific ranges that you need to be at in order to hit. Sure, you can use a normal to hit your opponent and resummon Eddie in a different position, but do you want to do that if you're not going to hit the opponent? It feels like you're constantly behind on card economy. The inherent RNG that comes from drawing cards from a deck also means that you won't really be able to plan out eddy setups. When I was playing Zato, I constantly felt like I almost had what I needed to get the ball rolling, but these setups would get interrupted by just playing cards to move and counterattack so I could stay alive. Sure, I could wild swing to preserve my hand, but for pretty much every character, there are only 2 of each card in the deck, and losing a card with Zato feels even worse than it does with any other character. Zato is not blatantly weak, but I think a lot of little things about him and the game's mechanics add up to make him underwhelming. I understand that puppet characters are very difficult to balance in both video and board games, so I don't want to knock the game too hard for Zato. That said, level 99 has already implemented a puppet character once, with Carl from BlazBlue being playable in the Exceed system. I don't want overpowered Zato, I just want him to feel viable.
Scoring! Now it's time for a recommended score, where we try to critically evaluate the aforementioned pros and cons, with the caveat of whether or not this is even a good idea in the first place. And this is a 1v1 card dueler that is using a lot of fighting game ideas. Seems like a fine idea to me. Oh, and then also this isn't the most normal review because we have Adam over here giving all this cool insight on the game. But we both agreed that this is a 7 out of 10. It is good. Guilty Gear Strive the board game is the faithful card game adaptation of a real-time fleshed out system that I never played but Adam has. And so Adam was surprised on how they were able to pour a lot of the same feelings and matchup tensions from the screen into playing cards. Okay, sure, there's some inherent constraints about porting a complicated fighting game with lots of math and real-timeness into a board game. We definitely noticed that making everything an integer in the gauge usage, as said before, but also for positioning in spaces instead of pixels, leads to a lot of rounding in the porting. Another way to say this in more normal English is that +1 movement in this game is a lot. There's not that many spaces. Whereas maybe in the game, to speed something up, you would just have a couple more frames per second, right? But hey, if you don't like fighting game inputs, because that's not for everyone, this is a totally acceptable trade-off. If you're a Strive fan that happens to like card games too, you likely won't be mad about these minor hiccups as well. Unless you're a Zato player, maybe. You will be rewarded though for knowing the video game gameplay and matchups well, and the asymmetry and uniqueness of each of the 20 characters, and consequently their matchups, is incredible replay value for a box. Yes, you will have to cough over money that's closer to $200 than $100, which is a sheer cliff of a barrier to entry. But you are getting a game that you can play again and again and again, likely even after they come out with a new version of Guilty Gear. Still, pricing is punishing Guilty Gear Strive because it's mostly just cards and you have to buy the $130 plus shipping worth of them. Sure, you can acquire the base game Soul vs. Kai matchup for just shipping costs on their website, so that's a lot cheaper. But is there another way these beloved characters could have been packaged? Like maybe including 6 characters for under $100? If we look at the Exceed packaging for the other video games, they have 4 characters for $50, so they could do the same for Guilty Gear. Here's 4 characters we think would work to be bundled together for Strive. You just gotta have more than 2 at a time in a box though, because our testing didn't feel complete until we played many varied matchups against each other. You can't do that with the demo. Right now you're getting one board game that costs more than Strive plus the 4 DLC season passes all put together, and you get less characters in the board game and you have to buy it all at once. As for mechanics, if we were being nitpicky, we have another where your starting hand of 5 is always random. It can lead to weird starts as you only have 2 of every card in your deck, but there's plenty of ways to draw and discard cards in the game. So even if you're stuck with all your port opener cards or worst case, all ultimates in your hand, it's still playable. Still, we can see some serious groups wanting to house rule that they get to pick their opening hand. And be warned, again, Strive the board game is not the most accessible card game out there. It front loads a lot of reading, and that's why we're so adamant about having better fighter explanations. Like, there's no training room or bots you can play to get a feel for a character. It's purely a 1v1 human against human, where time is probably limited and valuable. Anyways, if you get over the major hurdles of pricing and accessibility, don't be afraid to get this. If you're in the interesting intersection of being a Guilty Gear fan or friends with a Guilty Gear fan and want a turn-based game now with the same deep asymmetry, go ahead and pool your money together. And then if you don't know anything about Guilty Gear, but the fighting systems in this look interesting to you, go ahead and check out the other Exceed packaging over here.
My personal score for Guilty Gear Strive, the board game, is a 9 out of 10. I love this game. When I was first reading through everything, I was actually expecting to be disappointed. I imagine this is how Exard players felt about Strive on Strive's release. It seemed like a lot of the stuff that I liked about Guilty Gear Strive was missing from this game. Thankfully, I gave this game a try and was pleasantly surprised. As mentioned earlier, most characters feel like pretty faithful representations of their in-game self. I'm glad to see that no 2 characters feel really samey, and I find myself wanting to go back and play this again. Even though I think Zato is a bit on the weaker side, I do feel like I want to go back and play him a few more times just to see if I can push him and myself to perform better. To be clear, this game is by no means a one-to-one representation of Guilty Gear Strive. It's its own game. That said, I think a lot of my personal enjoyment comes from this game being Guilty Gear themed. So if it wasn't, this game would probably drop down to a 7 out of 10 for me. I normally enjoy 1v1 card games like Star Wars Unlimited, and this is a solid, engaging game, hence the 7 out of 10. But if this wasn't Guilty Gear themed, I don't know if I'd have the patience to read through all of the front-loaded information that they throw at you when you're first starting the game. I think this game is a great way to introduce friends to the world of Guilty Gear without them having to worry about learning a fighting game, which I understand can be very intimidating to a lot of people. I'm going to try to play this with as many of my non-FGC friends to see if they enjoy it enough to play Strive. And even if they don't, I'm just glad I have yet another way to enjoy Guilty Gear with my friends.
My personal score for the Guilty Gear board game is going to be a 8 out of 10. I have a great time with it, and I'm surprised how much I like it. Okay, even though I am labeling it as great, it does fare pretty low in the greatness scale, because I'll probably only play with Adam. This art and world of Guilty Gear is cool to me, except when it's too over-sexualized, but it's usually not. But it's not compelling me enough to play the game outside of playing with Adam. Okay, let me back up a little bit. So I have a profound respect for fighting games and people that dedicated time to get good at fighting games. I was just never the person that was that good at them, and I never bothered to improve in like a training room or something. And then also my eyes get kind of tired just watching all the flashy things on screen. So my first board game fighting game was BattleCon many years ago. I did a print and play version in high school. And despite reading hype for it online, I was just kind of like meh. Obviously I was a different board gamer back then, but I remember it feeling exceedingly repetitive. I think the perfect information of everyone's hand just wasn't appealing to me. Now, this Drive board game gives me this incredible opportunity to get good at a fighting game while being combined with a 1v1 TCG, which I tend to really like. Now, the Exceed system isn't completely new to me. I played about a year ago with a friend, and I thought it was impressive, but I didn't really know what I was doing because I felt like I was button mashing by just playing cards. So now for this review, I was able to get decently deep in with Adam, and it was really satisfying getting each character to attack and position how I really wanted them to. It was easy to get in the flow with this game and feel like it was an actual back and forth fight. It was when I got really comfortable using every single basic cards top and bottom, so about after 4 games, then I felt like I was actually playing the game. And getting good at canceling with cards kind of feels like playing a video game where you're starting to animation cancel and get to do extra things. One of my favorite things to do here actually is to cancel a focus. This forces my opponent to wild swing, and I only do this when I've been keeping track perfectly of what's in their deck, so I know that what they can wild swing will never ever beat my card in speed. And the characters all have a lot of personality from what I've tried. The ones I played are shown on screen, and again, it really helped that Adam could explain the matchups as we go. I've yet to play or see a character that feels too samey from the other ones, and that makes my matchup fantasy go bananas. So many characters, so much possibility of gaming. So what is this game missing from my personal enjoyment? Well, really, not that much. Like, I would say it doesn't really let you combo as much as other TCGs I've played, where the late game in those games can be really satisfying with getting cool Yu-Gi-Oh combos, or Ash just spending mana perfectly. These games tend to let you think of new creative uses to apply cards, but Strive trades in that card craziness with more mind games because you need to land your attacks. Basically, I never feel as big brain playing Strive the board game, but it always exists in this entertaining back and forth. Plus, it always feels like anyone's game because landing this is so hard. Anyways, upon a lot of reflection, this would probably be a 7 out of 10 if I didn't play with Adam. And seeing how this game is more complicated to learn than other 1v1 card games in this space, I think after this review, I will humbly give this box to Adam. Thank you for watching the review of Guilty Gear Strive, the board game. Oh, you see this game? Well, this might be coming up, a review for that. This is where I can announce that we have our Patreon and also our Coffee down in the link below. If you really want to help us, support us to make these reviews, because it does take a long time to make them. I think we played Guilty Gear Strive, like, what, we played 15 characters, so you do the math. Where was I? Right. Like, comment, subscribe. If you're into fighting games, I'd love to hear your feedback on our Guilty Gear Strive, the board game review. Anyways, let me get back to War for Arrakis. Oh my god, this game's gonna be a